The first-class cabin of the luxury airliner was a haven of comfort and exclusivity. Plush leather seats, the soft hum of engines, and a selection of fine wines set the perfect atmosphere for an easy flight. The passengers settling into their seats were a mix of business elites, celebrities, and well-dressed travelers who carried themselves with quiet confidence. Among them was Mark, a middle-aged businessman who had made a fortune in tech. He prided himself on his success, often making it a point to remind others of his wealth and status. As he adjusted his designer blazer and sipped his pre-flight champagne, he noticed an older man settling into the seat next to him. The man was dressed simply, jeans, a button-up shirt, and a weathered leather jacket. He had a rugged look, his face lined with years of experience, but his presence didn't exude the wealth or prestige that Mark expected from first-class passengers. Mark took one look at him and smirked. "Did they upgrade coach passengers today?" he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few chuckles followed, though some passengers looked uncomfortable. The older man glanced at him with calm eyes, but said nothing. Mark wasn't finished. He leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. "I swear they'll let just about anyone into first class these days. No offense, but you don't exactly look like you belong here." The flight attendant, who had just arrived to take orders, tensed slightly at Mark's words. The older man simply smiled and shook his head. "No offense taken," he said, his voice gravelly yet composed. Mark chuckled, mistaking the man's calm demeanor for submission. "I mean, it's not like you're some big-shot CEO or a Hollywood star, right? First class is for people who've actually made something of themselves." The flight attendant, clearly uncomfortable, shifted on her feet. She glanced at the older man as if expecting a reaction, but he remained completely at ease. A few seats away, another passenger, a younger man in a designer suit, turned and grinned. "You really don't recognize him, do you?" Mark frowned. "Recognize him?" He turned back to the older man, studying him more closely. The rugged face, the piercing eyes, the strong jawline. There was something familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Then, the realization hit him like a freight train. Clint Eastwood. Mark's mouth went dry. His brain scrambled for an excuse, an explanation, anything to cover up his mistake. "Wait. You're Clint Eastwood?" His voice had lost its arrogant edge. The older man gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "Last time I checked." A wave of murmurs passed through the first-class cabin. Some passengers who had already recognized Eastwood exchanged amused glances, while others stared in awe. Even the flight attendant looked embarrassed for Mark. Mark swallowed hard. I didn't mean any disrespect," he stammered. Clint Eastwood leaned back in his seat, finally breaking into a slight smirk. "Oh, I know." His voice was steady, carrying the weight of decades in Hollywood, of iconic roles and unforgettable performances. "You just assumed." Mark felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him. He had been so quick to judge, so certain that wealth and success could only look a certain way. And yet, sitting next to him was a man whose legacy spanned generations, an actor, director, and legend who had nothing left to prove. The rest of the flight was a quiet one for Mark. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, his earlier confidence completely drained. As the plane touched down and passengers began gathering their belongings, Clint Eastwood stood, grabbed his worn leather bag, and turned to Mark one last time. "Lesson for you," he said in that familiar, gravelly voice. "Real success doesn't always need to show off." And with that, he walked off the plane, leaving Mark sitting there, humbled and humiliated, knowing he had just made a fool of himself in front of a living legend. Mark remained seated long after Clint Eastwood had disappeared down the jet bridge. The weight of embarrassment sat heavy on his chest. He had spent years believing that success was something to be flaunted, that prestige was measured by designer, suits, expensive watches, and first-class tickets. But today he had been put in his place, without a single insult, without a raised voice. Passengers filed out around him, some glancing at him with barely concealed amusement, others with quiet pity. The flight attendant, who had witnessed the entire exchange, gave him a small, knowing smile as she passed. Mark exhaled sharply and finally stood up, adjusting his blazer like it could somehow restore his dignity. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, his mind replayed Clint's parting words. Real success doesn't always need to show off. It was such a simple statement, yet it carried more weight than anything Mark had ever read in a business book or heard in a motivational speech. He had spent his life chasing status, surrounding himself with people who valued wealth over wisdom. And yet, here was Clint Eastwood, a man worth millions, a Hollywood legend, who didn't care about proving anything to anyone. As Mark made his way through the airport, he pulled out his phone and instinctively searched Clint Eastwood's name. The list of achievements was staggering. Award-winning actor, legendary director, cultural icon, a man who had lived his life on his own terms, never needing to flash his wealth or demand recognition. Mark stopped walking, staring at the screen. For the first time in years, he felt like the smallest man in the room. Something shifted inside him. He wasn't sure if it would happen overnight, but one thing was certain: he would never make the same mistake again. As Mark lowered his phone, he took a deep breath and walked toward the airport lounge. His usual routine after a flight was to grab a drink, make a few business calls, and bask in the satisfaction of being a first-class traveler. But today he felt no need for any of it. Instead, he found himself sitting in a quiet corner, staring at the large windows overlooking the runway, deep in thought. For years he had built his identity around his wealth. He measured people by their appearances, by the cars they drove, the brands they wore, the level of service they expected. But Clint Eastwood had shattered that illusion in mere seconds. Without anger, without humiliation, just a quiet confidence that spoke louder than any arrogance ever could. Mark ran a hand through his hair, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: humility. He thought back to how he had treated people over the years: staff at restaurants, flight attendants, even colleagues who didn't fit his definition of successful. Had he ever taken a moment to really see them? To respect them for who they were rather than what they had? His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his business partner. Landing in LA soon. Hope you got some rest on the flight. What's next on the agenda? For the first time, Mark hesitated before replying. Normally, he would have responded with a list of meetings, deals to close, and people to impress. But now, all of it felt different. After a moment, he typed back, "Got a lot to think about. Let's talk tomorrow." He put his phone away, stood up, and walked out of the lounge. This time, he wasn't in a rush. He wasn't checking his reflection in every polished surface. He wasn't looking for someone to impress. For the first time in his life, Mark wasn't concerned with looking successful. He wanted to be better. The next few days felt like a quiet shift for Mark. He still kept up with his work, of course, but the conversations had changed. He found himself listening more than talking, genuinely paying attention to people he'd previously ignored. Whether it was a barista at a coffee shop or a colleague at a meeting, Mark began to see the value in people beyond their titles or status. It wasn't an overnight transformation. He still caught himself occasionally falling back into his old ways, measuring success by wealth or outward appearances. But each time he remembered Clint Eastwood's words: real success doesn't always need to show off. One evening, Mark attended a charity gala, a gathering of influential figures in the business world, the kind of event he usually thrived in. But instead of trying to dominate the conversation, he found himself standing at the back of the room, observing. He watched as people bragged about their latest acquisitions, their newest investments, and the latest social circles they'd infiltrated. A familiar face approached him, an old friend who had once been Mark's main source of validation. "Mark, good to see you," the man said, shaking his hand enthusiastically. "I hear you've been making big moves lately. What's your latest project?" Mark paused. In the past, he would have launched into a detailed pitch about his latest venture, eager to impress. But instead, he found himself saying, "I've been learning a lot about what really matters." His friend raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Mark smiled softly. "I mean, I've been focusing more on the people around me, on really seeing them, not just their status or wealth, but who they are. His friend stared at him clearly, puzzled. You okay, man? You've been different lately. Mark nodded, a small laugh escaping him. Yeah, I guess you could say I'm just trying to be a little more real with myself. The conversation ended soon after, but Mark didn't mind. He didn't need to win the approval of the room anymore. For the first time in a long while, he was content simply being present, not measuring his worth against anyone else. That night, as he lay in bed, Mark thought about Clint Eastwood again. He wondered if the actor had ever faced moments like these, where the world tried to define him by what he had, what he could do, who he knew, and yet through it all Clint had remained grounded, never needing to flaunt his success, just letting his work and presence speak for itself. Maybe that was the real key to success, not how much you earned, but how much you gave, how you treated others, and how you carried yourself when no one was watching. The next day, Mark made a call to an old acquaintance, a staff member who had worked for him years ago, but whom he'd always treated with indifference. He had never given this person a second thought, but now he wanted to do something different. Hey, it's Mark, he said when they answered the phone. I've been thinking a lot lately, and I just wanted to say thank you for all the hard work you did. I'm sorry if I ever treated you like you didn't matter. You do, and I appreciate you. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mark, thank you. That really means a lot. I didn't expect to hear from you. Mark smiled, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Well, I guess you can say I've been learning some lessons the hard way. And for the first time in a long time. Mark felt like he was on the right path. Not because he had more to show the world, but because he had finally learned to see the world differently. As the weeks passed, Mark continued on this new path of reflection and growth. He found that his interactions with people had taken on a new depth. He was no longer chasing the approval of the elite or seeking validation from those who could further his career. Instead, he started building authentic connections, asking questions, listening, and truly engaging with others. His colleagues noticed the shift in him, some even commenting on how much more approachable and present he seemed. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when the pressures of business and the allure of old habits tried to pull him back into his former mindset. But each time he felt that pull, Mark reminded himself of the lesson he had learned on the plane with Clint Eastwood. One afternoon, Mark was in a meeting with his team, discussing a new project. The room was filled with high-powered individuals, all trying to outshine each other with their ideas and opinions. Normally, Mark would have jumped in, eager to lead the conversation and make his voice heard. But this time, something shifted. Instead of dominating the room, he chose to step back, listen, and let others contribute. A young associate who had been quieter than usual finally spoke up with an idea that was brilliant and innovative. Mark leaned forward, nodding in appreciation. That's a fantastic idea, he said with genuine enthusiasm. Why don't you take the lead on that? I think it could make a huge difference. The young associate's eyes lit up with surprise and gratitude. The rest of the room shifted their attention to the new direction Mark had just opened up. Mark realized that by empowering others and valuing their input, he was fostering an environment of collaboration rather than competition. A few days later, Mark received an unexpected invitation. A personal note slipped under his office door from Clint Eastwood. It read, I hear you've been doing some good work. Keep it up, kid. It's the little things that matter. Mark smiled as he read it, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't expected. It wasn't just that Clint Eastwood had acknowledged his growth, but that someone who had lived such a remarkable life had taken the time to offer a few kind words. It was a reminder that true success wasn't measured by accolades or fame. It was about living with integrity, humility, and respect for others. The next time Mark flew first class, he didn't feel the need to prove anything. He no longer looked around for validation or compared himself to others. Instead, he sat quietly by the window, watching the world below, feeling a deep sense of peace that he had never known before. Success, he now realized, wasn't about having the biggest bank, account, or the flashiest title. It was about the impact you had on the people around you, the respect you showed, and the way you carried yourself through life. And in that moment, Mark understood something Clint Eastwood had known all along. The quietest people in the room often make the biggest difference. And so Mark continued to move forward, not just as a businessman, but as someone who had learned that sometimes the best way to succeed was to let go of the need to be seen and just be. As Mark embraced his new way of thinking, the changes in his personal and professional life began to unfold in unexpected and rewarding ways. His relationships with his team members flourished, and his business started seeing positive results in ways he hadn't anticipated. People responded to his authenticity, and he quickly realized how much easier it was to create meaningful connections when he wasn't trying to impress anyone. One morning, Mark had an important meeting scheduled with a potential investor who was known for his high standards and relentless drive. In the past, Mark would have spent hours preparing an elaborate pitch, fine-tuning every detail to ensure he came across as the ideal partner. But this time, he took a different approach. He spent the evening before the meeting thinking not about how to impress the investor, but about how to understand his needs, values, and vision. When they sat down in the meeting, Mark listened more than he spoke. He asked questions, acknowledged the investor's concerns, and genuinely sought to understand his perspective. Instead of presenting a polished, rehearsed speech, he shared a candid, honest discussion about where his business stood and where it was heading. He talked about his recent realizations about the importance of authenticity, collaboration, and a focus on people. He didn't try to hide the mistakes he'd made or the lessons he'd learned, because he knew now that vulnerability was a strength. The investor, who was initially reserved and focused on the numbers, seemed to soften as the conversation progressed. He opened up about his own experiences and what he valued in partnerships. By the end of the meeting, he extended an offer that was more generous than Mark had expected. "What I appreciate about you, Mark, is your ability to be real," the investor said with a smile. "I can tell you're not just about making a deal. You care about building something lasting. That's the kind of partner I want to work with." Mark left the meeting feeling a sense of gratitude he hadn't felt in years. The investor didn't buy into the usual power plays or flashy promises. He saw the value in honesty, integrity, and a commitment to long-term success. And for the first time, Mark realized that he no longer had to be someone he wasn't to succeed. The things that truly mattered, honesty, humility, respect, were the very things that could propel him forward. Over the next several months, Mark's business continued to grow, but it was no longer just about profits or expansion. It was about creating an environment where people felt valued, where ideas could thrive, and where success was defined by the positive impact they could make together. His employees began to open up more, offering their own ideas without fear of judgment. The atmosphere in the office shifted to one of collaboration, and the company culture flourished. One day, as Mark walked through the office, he passed by a group of employees chatting by the break room. He overheard them discussing their latest project, and he smiled as he realized how much they had taken ownership of their work. They were excited, engaged, and genuinely interested in making the company better. It was a moment of reflection for him. He had come so far from the arrogant businessman who had once believed success was about outshining everyone else. Now, he understood that true success was about empowering others, supporting their growth, and creating something that would outlast any individual achievement. As he returned to his desk, his phone buzzed with a message from an old friend, the one he'd reached out to weeks ago. "I've been hearing great things about your recent changes. Proud of you, man. Keep it up." Mark smiled, feeling the weight of his transformation. He wasn't the same person he had been when he'd first encountered Clint Eastwood on that plane. He was more grounded, more aware of the power of humility and respect. Looking out the window of his office, Mark realized that the path ahead wasn't defined by the accolades or titles he once chased. Instead, it was defined by the kind of person he had become, the kind of leader who didn't need to prove anything, but instead focused on lifting others up. And for the first time in a long time, he was truly content with the direction his life was heading.